Conquering a land is one thing, but controlling it, that's an entirely different game. At its peak, the British Empire ruled over a staggering quarter of the Earth's population. We're talking about hundreds of millions of people, spread across continents from India and Africa to Southeast Asia. And yet, this colossal empire was managed by just a few thousand British officials and soldiers. So, how did a small island nation hold together such vast, diverse territories? The answer isn't in brute force or overwhelming numbers. It lies in a masterful blend of strategy, structure, and psychology. Today, we're diving deep into how Britain ruled the world without an army big enough to occupy it. Let's start with a classic strategy, perfected by the Romans and mastered by the British. Divide and rule. The principle is simple, yet devastatingly effective. Instead of trying to suppress everyone, you amplify the existing divisions within a society. Religion, tribe, caste, ethnicity. Any fault line was a potential tool. In India, for instance, a key strategy was to ensure that Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs never found common political ground to unite against British rule. In Africa, colonial administrators drew borders with little regard for the people living there, often splitting tribes or forcing rival groups into the same territory, then favoring one over the other. By constantly stoking these internal conflicts, Britain made sure that the people they ruled were too busy fighting each other to ever join forces and fight them. A divided population doesn't need to be defeated in a massive war. It just needs to be managed. Now, who did the actual managing? You might picture an army of Brits in every town and village, but the reality was completely different. The British Empire was largely run by local people themselves. Take the British Indian Army, the force that secured the jewel in the crown. Over 90% of its soldiers were Indians, known as sepoys, who were commanded by a small number of British officers. It wasn't just the military. Across the entire empire, it was local chiefs, clerks, and policemen who enforced British laws on the ground. Why would they do it? The motivations were universal: a steady salary, a sense of prestige, or the taste of real power. By creating a system where locals had a stake in maintaining the colonial structure, Britain ruled through the people, not just over them. This leads us to the next layer of their strategy: indirect rule. Instead of dismantling existing power structures, the British often chose to co-opt them. Kings, sultans, chiefs, and princes were often allowed to keep their titles and continue ruling their people, at least in name. But there was a catch. Their authority was no longer inherent. It was granted and approved by the British. Behind every local ruler, there was a British resident or governor, a quiet advisor whose suggestions were, in reality, commands. To the average person, it looked like their traditional leaders were still in charge. It created an illusion of autonomy. But in truth, it was control from the shadows, a puppet show where Britain pulled all the strings. Of course, control isn't just political, it's also economic. Britain ingeniously wove a web of economic dependence that tied its colonies to the motherland. Local economies were systematically redesigned to serve British industry. Colonies became vast plantations and mines, exporting raw materials like cotton from India, tea from Ceylon, and rubber from Malaya, all at prices set by London. What did they get in return? They became captive markets for British manufactured goods. This created a one-way flow of wealth straight into the coffers of London. Local elites who cooperated with this system got rich. Those who resisted or tried to build their own industries found themselves economically isolated and crushed. The empire's strongest chains weren't made of iron. They were forged from trade deficits and economic dependency. But perhaps the most powerful and lasting strategy was the conquest of the mind. The British understood a profound truth. To rule the future, you must shape how people think. They established schools and universities across the empire, but the curriculum wasn't designed to celebrate local culture. It was designed to export British culture. Subjects were taught in English, using British textbooks that glorified British history and values. The goal, as one colonial administrator famously wrote, was to create a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. This new Western-educated elite became the backbone of the colonial bureaucracy. They were doctors, lawyers, and civil servants who were often more loyal to the British system that had elevated them than to their own people. This mental colonization proved to be far more enduring than any military victory. To hold all this together, you need to control the flow of information and the movement of people. Britain mastered the lifelines of empire, communication and logistics. They built and controlled the press, the postal service, the railways, and most importantly, the telegraphs. An order from London could reach a governor in India in a matter of hours, not months. Troops could be moved rapidly by rail to quell a potential uprising before it even started. News could be managed, censored, and shaped to fit the official narrative. The telegraph wire and the railway line were not just tools of modernization. They were extensions of British authority, allowing a small group of administrators to monitor and control a vast empire in near real time. Technology didn't just connect the empire, it kept it on a leash. Power, especially foreign power, needs a cloak of legitimacy. The British provided this with a complex and seemingly impartial system of law and bureaucracy. They established courts, tax collection agencies, and a civil administration that operated on predictable rules and procedures. On the surface, this bureaucracy gave the impression of fairness, order, and justice, a welcome change from what was often portrayed as the arbitrary rule of local princes. But its real purpose was to ensure stability and, crucially, the efficient collection of revenue to pay for the whole colonial enterprise. The system was designed to make rebellion seem not only dangerous, but illogical. The empire didn't just rule by the sword, it ruled by the official stamp, the legal document, and the tax receipt. But what happened when all these subtle methods of control failed? When persuasion and manipulation weren't enough, Britain was quick to reveal the iron fist inside the velvet glove. Fear was the ultimate backstop. Although British forces were small in number, they possessed overwhelming technological superiority. Advanced rifles, devastating artillery, and powerful naval guns meant that no local army could stand against them in a conventional fight. When major uprisings did occur, like the Indian Revolt of 1857, the response was swift and merciless. Rebellions were crushed with brutal efficiency. Entire villages were burned, and leaders were publicly executed. The message was sent, loud and clear: defiance will cost you everything. This calculated use of terror created a climate of fear that served as the empire's silent, ever-present governor. To justify all of this, both to the world and to themselves, the British crafted a powerful ideology. They sold their empire as a benevolent, civilizing mission. This was the famous or infamous concept of the white man's burden, the idea that it was the duty of Europeans to bring progress, Christianity, and order to the supposedly backward peoples of the world. This narrative was relentlessly pushed through schools, churches, and the press. Colonized people were taught to believe that British rule, despite its harsh realities, was ultimately for their own good. For some, collaboration became the only logical path to modernity. The British didn't just colonize land. They attempted to colonize the human spirit itself, making people complicit in their own subjugation. Finally, perhaps the greatest strength of the British imperial system was its sheer adaptability. This was not a rigid, one-size-fits-all empire. Britain's approach was brilliantly pragmatic and flexible. It would offer harsh repression in one colony while granting generous reforms and a degree of self-government in another. They made treaties with some rulers and overthrew others. They knew when to compromise, when to stand firm, and when to retreat. This constant adaptation and strategic flexibility kept their opponents off balance and fragmented. The empire survived for so long not because it was unshakable, but because it was constantly evolving, bending so it wouldn't break. So, in the end, Britain didn't rule a quarter of the world with just guns and soldiers. The numbers were never in their favor. Instead, they built a sophisticated system of control. It was a vast pyramid, with a small British elite at the very top. But that pyramid was held up by a massive base of local collaborators, soldiers, and administrators, all working to maintain the empire for their own reasons, be it profit, prestige, or simply survival. Empires rise through conquest, but they endure through the control of economies, institutions, and most importantly, the control of the mind. And that is how a tiny island nation once ruled the world. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this journey into the mechanics of empire fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next video.